Hello, welcome to the 50-minute hour. My name is Corey, and today I'm joined by Seraphim, Calvin, and Hank, and our guest from Paris, France, Semyon, who is going to be speaking on Platonism and Islamic thought, as well as universalism. And hopefully, we have a good conversation relating Western Christianity and Islamic thought on those planes. Without further ado, here's the phone call.
Okay, so why don't we just start off with you briefly saying a little bit about who you are, maybe what you're studying, what your interest is. So just do a little brief introduction for our listeners, and then we'll start.
So I present rapidly myself. I'm Semyon from Paris. I have a Bachelor of Arts in History of the Islamic world and a Master of Arts in Islamic Studies, as well as a Bachelor of Arts in Linguistics, especially focused on Farsi language. For those who do not know what is Farsi, Farsi is Persian language spoken from Iran to Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and related areas. Regarding my own philosophical and theological thoughts and schools, I would describe myself to some kind of neo-Platonism. But recently, I tried to work on a new way to present it in a way which can be, well, not revolutionary, but which can be changed our perspective regarding how we view substance and ideas, especially if we depict the world not as having, substantial and intrinsic, how can I say it, intrinsic essence, but rather in terms of interconnected phenomena. So, yeah, I try to build something up out of Platonism and Islam. And regarding universalism, I'm a proponent of universalism.
Semyon, let me start by asking you this. Are you familiar with Hans Jonas, the Gnostic religion?
Not at all. So can you explain a bit about it?
Yeah, so I'm just looking for the premise here because I'm interested in the Islamic interpretation on who Socrates and Plato are in this regard. So basically, he's a Jewish scholar from the New School for Social Research, and his premise is that ultimately, to get past all the complexities, Socrates and Plato were drawing ultimately out of Moses. And what you see happening in the Hellenic boom of philosophy is a combination between the Jewish and Eastern thought through trade routes that culminated in the Egyptian priest class and theology and eventually worked its way into Socrates and Plato. And I bring this point up because I'm like, for instance, in Eastern Christianity with St. Justin Martyr, you have this idea that Socrates was sort of like the first martyr for the Christian religion, or commentary on the daemon that Socrates was influenced by. Was that a daemon from God or Allah? What is sort of the, I guess, in your view, the Islamic thought on exactly what was going on with Socrates and Plato, because they seem foundational both to Christian and Islamic philosophy?
Yeah. Well, as you may expect, Plato and Socrates are very important in Islamic thought, and many represent them as great thinkers first, but also for some people as models which are close to the prophetic ones. For example, Al-Ghazali, a famous Sunni scholar, in his book on work and subsistence, taught a lot Socrates, as well as Muhammad. I mean, he put Socrates in the same level of authority than the prophet regarding virtues, ethics, and systematic philosophy. So, yeah, for Islamic thought, it was it was a great discovery to be put in contact with the Greek wisdom and with Greek philosopher. And as for the daemon of Socrates, I do think that it's close to how Islamic thinkers describe the experience of revelation. I mean, it's like a spirit, an intuition which talks to you and guides you, rather than a little angel coming to you. There is a popular vision, even among Muslims, that Muhammad met a literal angel, while in truth, if you read Islamic scholars, Ustaz Ghazali, and even Sajistini regarding Shia thought, you may understand that it wasn't really an angel as depicted in common culture, but rather some kind of spirit of inspiration and of great thought, of great strength, and of great how can I say it? There is a great connivance to truth within the spirit, which inspire men like Muhammad, but also men like Socrates and Plato to produce models which are even nowadays emulated both by Christian and Muslims.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, the spirit that appears to Muhammad and the spirit that is appearing to Socrates is something that more or less all men have access to.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
they are pretty similar in nature, but the scale of the experience is different between Socrates and Muhammad. Socrates is described more as, a step within this history of revelation. He has some kind of, instinctive link to the spirits, but it wasn't complete. I mean, each prophet come with degrees of completeness regarding the spirit, this intellect which transmits beautiful wisdom and magnificent law. And Socrates was a step in it, a very ancient one, and it can explain why he has some difficulties to describe it.
So going from here, this sort of common spirit, potentially accessible by every person, but especially, let's say, by prophets, Socrates, Moses, Christ, Muhammad. What do you think was the intentions of the divine in assigning Socrates and Plato and maybe Aristotle as well, all to the same, more or less same location in the same time period, right before the coming of Christianity and eventually leading up to the coming of Islam? Do you think it was particularly intentional for them to be assigned where they were at the time they were in order to prepare the Hellenistic world for the reception of that philosophy?
I do think that this revelation experience lived by Socrates and many other great philosophers helped us to spread some kind of global monotheism, because as you know, it's the Greek world did some of the greatest projection of forces which ever happened with the conquest of Alexander, which united, the West and the East within a new entity, which permitted to ideas, to concepts, to man, and to systems to travel very fast. So, in some way, I do think that the divine prepared the world to monotheism by first stepping in Greece, where the mind of people were like prepared for it, and where the disposition of people were like ready to project themselves out of the small Greece of ancient times.
Right. Okay. So I guess jumping off from this, from the philosophy to the theology that's being shared in the Islamic and Christian worlds, in the New Testament we have a phrase that is that death is the last enemy to die, which I think in many ways is supportive of a universalist idea, though you almost never hear Christians cite this verse. Is there anything equivalent to that in the Quran or Islamic thought, that death is the last thing that dies itself?
Um, I mean, there is in the Quran the fact that all things shall be merged or disappearing within the face of God. There is a verse in Quran saying that there will be a time where everything, and when we say everything, there is no specification. It could be both Earth, cosmos, even hell, to disappear, and after that, all uh, all what remains is the face of God. No, so in a sense, there is some kind of idea that hell, as an experience of suffering, should not last eternity, and this was a view embraced by some theologian. Among Sunnis, there is, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, who proposed three possibilities regarding hell and suffering. The first one, which is very classical, is what I could call infernalism, like hell will be eternal and suffering will be eternal. The second possibility is that hell will remain but will be empty. So every soul will ascend to heaven. And by this process, suffering and by extension death, which is the greatest of all suffering, will end. And the last possibility is that hell will be destroyed with people inside it. That's the last possibility.
So like annihilation.
Yeah. My opinion on this possibilities is that I kind of go for the second one, because there is a very famous hadith, very famous tradition found in both Sunni and Shia hadith corpus, reported by a Sahaba. Sahaba is like a companion of the Prophet, called Jabir ibn Abdullah, who heard the Prophet say that Allah will take people from the fire and bring them to heavens. So there is the idea that He will directly take people who are like suffering and being tormented in hell, and just stop their suffering by raising them to Jannah, to heaven, and to come back to the trajectory of history. I think that whole movements are the conjunction of or march toward the greater good. I mean, there is suffering right now. There is injustice. There is bigotry, of course. There is discrimination. But slowly we advance toward a greater well-being for everyone. So, knowing this, the end of all things shall be the greater good, and the greater good is the end of suffering, but the absolute end of suffering, not just the end of suffering for some chosen or elected people, but for everyone.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but it strikes me that in Islam, like Christianity, the popular majority view is not that of the universalist interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, because it's necessary to defend infernalism in the conventional discourse. But if you read actual scholars who defended infernalism in the conventional sense and dive into their works, you will find out that they are somehow defended universalism too,
right,
as a sign of hope and as a sign of greatness. Because not all people are ready to accept universalism.
Right.
And for most of people, if universalism is true, then religious commitment would be nullified. and it will be also a justification for mediocrity,
Yes.
So yeah, you have to defend. There is two discourse you have to defend. There is a discourse which is conventional for people, and there is a discourse which is a matter of absolute truth, which is for a more restricted audience.
Yes. That follows quite in line with the patristic thought along the lines of Origin or Nisa, that even insofar this might be true, it's not something that should be taught liberally. At the same time, I don't know what it is in the Islamic world, but in the Christian world, the proverbial sense of the cat being out of the bag with universalism has seemed to come to the fore in a way that it doesn't really have historical precedent. And there might be various, let's say, even from a Marxist perspective, materialist reasons for why that is. Or maybe I'm wrong. Is the Islamic world also experiencing some sort of revival or opening up to universalism?
I would say that universalism is present within the Islamic perspective, but it remains a kind of thought you will only find about among elites.
So it's still quite esoteric.
People. Yeah.
Okay.
I wouldn't say esoteric, but more scholarly.
Okay.
I mean, there is an intellectual vision of universalism. There is an esoteric vision of universalism as well. You can perceive it in Sufism, even in Shia Islam, in what we call irfan, gnosis. But there is very orthodox scholars who are keen to defend universalism,
right?
But in a very scholar way, not esoteric in some kind. Because there is sources defending it, because the Prophet himself did some stuff that even his companion didn't understand. For example, there is an occurrence, a tradition in which he prayed for Bedouins who didn't pray, who didn't practice Islam, who didn't believe anyway, and he prayed for them to go to Jannah. And his wife Aisha asked him if these people were not Muslim at all would go to heaven, and the Prophet just replied to her, it would be the case with the mercy of God. And this tradition is found in the compilation of the greatest Sunni scholar who ever lived, Imam al-Ghazali, in his Epistle of Tolerance, which is one of the greatest books defending both plurality of religion, of beliefs, and also universalism in some kind.
I wanted to pause here. Did any of y'all have anything to add or any questions before I don't know, we go on to whatever?
I mean, I don't have a question as much about the universalism factor. I mean, Semyon, you and I have talked about this quite a bit, ourselves. What I'm very curious about, and if you want to change directions, is the way in which Platonic philosophy influences you and how you see it. In what ways does it fit in with Islam? Because I know Corey, for one, talks a lot about Plato. You bring up the dialogues quite often in our different podcasts as influencing your philosophy and your theology. It's very clear in a lot of early patristics that they were very influenced by Plato. I'm very curious, and this is a topic that you and I haven't really talked about that much, but in what ways, you said that you think that Plato was inspired by a spirit of a spirit of some sort that does speak to the prophets, that is accessible to people. In what ways does your reading of Plato, and what specific parts of Plato and what specific dialogues do you think really fit into Islamic thought and theology, and in what ways has it influenced your own philosophy and theology? That's what I'm very curious about.
There is two main ideas within Platonic philosophy, which is very important to my personal theology. The first being the ladders of intellect, the hierarchy of intellects. I don't know if you know much things about it.
We have Dionysius the Areopagite who divides this line, the hierarchy.
Yeah, so there is ladders of intellect, and which are degree of perfections, and this degree of perfection can be also be used to prove the necessity for a perfected intellect, which would be God. Like you pass from very low to no intellect, to go up, up, until to reach some degree of perfection within God, which is represented by God. And humans in this ladders are like a step of intermediate state between the intellect, which can receive wisdom from the upper intellects, but also an intellect which can come higher to get a higher position. And from this higher position, he will be able to educate lower intellects. It's an evolution, you know. It's like you receive a revelation from an upper intellect, which can be, you can call it like an angel, you can call it a diamond, you can call it anything you want. It's a higher intellect, and from this intellect, you are able to elevate yourself and transmit it to lower beings. It can be your fellow humans, can be something more universal, as we know that there is occurrence, for example, of Christian sins, teaching the doctrine to animals, for example. So in this way, I find this idea of degrees of intellect very comforting, in the fact that it gives an end to things, and you know, some kind of sense. And this sense, as I said earlier, will be the march towards a greater good, greater betterment. And that's also why this world could not be in another form. I hear a lot of atheists, for example, arguing that God would have created a world where all beings only do good things and ethical actions, and that this world would be perfect. But goodness and ethics are relative concepts. They don't have intrinsic existence of themselves, in themselves, for themselves. So you need to have some kind of progress of perfectibility to be able to identify both good and evil, the intellect and falsehood. So in this world where progress is possible, we can definitely say that it's the best possible world, because it opens the doors of constant progress, and Platonic hierarchy of, you know, intellects can give some answers to our goals and to the direction we go to. And the second Platonic idea, which is very important to me, is the theory of forms, which can say a lot about divine science, but also pre-science, because, you know, God is the external specifier of anything. And there is some kind of paradox, because, you know, to be able to create or to make something to emerge, you need first to know what you will create or what will emerge in the first place, to be a specifier. So the theory of forms, God is like a depository of all genus and ideas and concepts and forms, which will lead to the world. And through it, he creates the world, he generates it, and we can how can I say it? We can prove God with the fact that the world could not contain the condition of its own activity of production first, and of its own specification, because it didn't exist in the first place. so it couldn't specify itself. So we need some necessary being which contain all ideas, all forms, and all genus prior to the emergence of the world. And regarding the theory of form, I do think that the greater good, the salvation of everyone, is contained as an idea regarding the hand of all things, the march of all things. So my own interpretation of this theory of forms would be like we are expression, manifestation of perfected and already known forms within the scope of the divine. And for now, you and I are just parodies of these perfected forms, waiting for betterment to reach, like reflects in the mirror, to reach the perfect balance between what we should be and what is the perfect form contained in God, wisdom, and science. So there is a sense of betterment, and betterment can only be taught when put in the perspective of universalism, you know?
Right. Yeah. No, what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. I pretty much agree with you from the Orthodox perspective. One thing I'm wondering about as you're talking about this is in the Western world, mainly through Tertullian, but in the modern variation, it's more so the Protestants, that we have this idea that the pagan influence of early Christianity was totally corrupt. There's a Lutheran bishop who wrote this book called Eros and Agape, where he basically argues that Dionysius the Areopagite was a Platonist pagan spy who infiltrated successfully the entire church and spread all this Platonism and corrupted all of Christianity until not even Luther, like basically modern Protestantism came along and finally salvaged the church from all this paganism. Is there any sort of equivalent to that conspiracy theory in the Islamic thought? Because Islamic, to me, is, you know, as an outsider, Islamic thought seems even more overtly, in a good way, consciously aware of its influence by paganism than Christianity does.
Yeah, because, you know, scholars, when talking about the Greeks, were fully aware that they were polytheists and pagans, right? But there is in the Islamic thought a methodology which consists to take everything that is good and true, even if it comes from, you know, non-Abrahamic words. So as long as all these ideas and concepts are used to understand better the theology, the revelation, and the world, so it should be taken. And there were like a long polemics between theologians regarding philosophy, with the question: should we use philosophy to emulate the Greeks? Is it not dangerous to use philosophy to prove our dogma and to rationalize it? Should we stick to a more literal way to interpret the revelation? And it was a long debate within the Islamic circles of theologians. And hopefully, the philosophy didn't end defeated after this debate, because, you know, there is literally schools nowadays, but they are like very minority. I mean, there is Athari school, for example, among Sunni, which reject any influence of the Greek, but paradoxically use the ideas of the Greek. For example, Ibn Taymiyyah, who is like Athari, completely rejects Greek philosophy, even wrote a book about it. But his theory of knowledge and science, divine science, is like a copy and paste, of Plato theories of forms. So when you read it, you're like, okay, you reject Plato, but you just repeat what he said like centuries before. Like you don't invent anything. You just repeat what the ancients said.
Right. It seems basically impossible to actually do this, and I think it's ironic within the Christian world when you see people who try to draw this very distinct line between paganism and the teachings of Christ, because there's so many things that Christ say that you really have to give a very forced interpretation to trick yourself out of it agreeing with anything that a pagan philosopher thought. Um, it basically seems impossible.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, the idea, for example, of Trinity and of divinity developed by Christian letters is heavily influenced by neo-Platonism. I mean, you can read, for example, this idea of divinity of the Messiah within the writing of Philo of Alexandria. So, I mean, you can just erase the patrimony of Platonism within Christianity because it's fundamental to how we can understand Christian doctrine.
Yes. It's pretty naive. And what you see, I think, with a lot of Protestants is that they want to have their cake and eat it too by rejecting the so-called total political corruptions of the early church, but still taking all these philosophies that they attached on to the interpretation of Christ's teachings. Even their doctrine of infernalism, as I was saying in the last podcast, often ends up borrowing a lot from previous pagan ideas that were, for the most part, a very recent minority in the Pharisaical thought in Second Temple Judaism. The way this often gets justified with Orthodoxy or Catholics or Protestants who don't take this route is, say, like Justin Martyr's point that the logos that Christ is manifesting by is the logos and very structure of the cosmos. Therefore, if a pagan is worshiping nature, they are indirectly worshiping that logos. What would be the equivalent, I guess, in the Muslim thought, the Islamic thought, to that concept, right? To this idea that the pagans, the reason they're getting anything right is because they're worshiping creation of Allah, or what? Is there any?
Well, there is to describe people before the actualization of religion made by Muhammad, because you need first to understand that the Islamic perspective is that from our theological vision, Islam always existed for it's like but not Islam as Ramadan and Salat, etc., but more like a natural submission to God. So that's how we interpret it. Islam always existed among various people from various religions. And that's why there is a verse in Quran saying that Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but he was a Muslim. It's not saying that Abraham said the Shahada and do Ramadan, etc., right? It's more about the fact that Abraham worshipped the one true God. And among people who lived before the actualization of religion by Muhammad, of course, there is like people who intuitively will worship the manifestation of the divine in nature, within life itself. And because in Islam we reject original sin doctrine, and we talk about state of nature. We call this fitra. It's a state of nature of man, which is like the intuition of man for curiosity, empathy, solidarity, and to worship the great God, not in the most perfect way, not sometimes. Sometimes it can be lost, but not out of evilness, but more out of ignorance regarding his own condition. So it's not, polytheism is not interpreted as evil, but more about how man failed to understand correctly their inner nature.
So all that being said, what was the reason that Islam provides for why Allah waited to give a prophet to present things like Ramadan and praying 5 times a day very specifically to the peoples of the world? Was that just the ideal time and place when to strike when the iron was hot to spread Islam?
Well, there is a progress in history, and in Quran, in Surah 5, verse 48, we read that to each people, God gave a law and the method, writ, law. And the last occurrence within Muhammad's predication and prophetic mission is to finally give a writ, a method and law, which can be balanced and totally, devoid from corruption and modification with time. A writ and law, which can be both universal and understandable for from a certain locality. So, um, when Islam was first predicated by Muhammad, it was like the perfect time to actualize the religion, because for example, the Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, was divided between various Christian sects, fighting each other, and Heracles, for example, persecuted a lot of Christians in Egypt and Syria. And if you observe well the date of foundation of most of the great Oriental Church, you will notice that these dates of creation are simultaneous to the rise of a new power in the global geopolitical theater. So, in few words, Islam came the right time where Rome was failing to pursue its natural mission of universalism by, for example, persecuting the Jews and chasing them out from Palestine, and weakening itself in clueless wars against Persia. And Islam just came and, swallowed all this world and spread monotheism as far as India and Central Asia, areas which were mainly dominated by pagans, polytheism, ignorance. So it was the last moment of mankind's actualization of religion. That doesn't mean that Christianity is false, or that doesn't mean that. But that this moment was the right moment to actualize the history of revelation and religion.
All right, thank you. So circling back to this question of universalism, it seems from what you were saying earlier, and I just wanted to clarify that there is this understanding that the tradition of infernalism as a majority or popular view is good, even if it's not ultimately true, because it is maintaining a sense of adherence and submission to the majority of people who need, Saint Benedict says that when John is saying in the scripture in the New Testament that perfect love cast out fear, nonetheless, very few attain perfect love. So we need to maintain fear of God for the majority. That
definitely,
in this sense, infernalism in the Platonist sense is a noble lie of God. Not unlike in the Old Testament when he tells Jonah that Nineveh will be destroyed, or telling telling Abraham that Isaac will be sacrificed. God knows that this is not true, but God nonetheless knows that they're going to interpret it as true. Does that mean God is lying? Well, you can look at it in a very logical way, but in a more mystical way, it's the noble lie of Plato, right? That God is giving us a deeper truth through a lie, kind of like what Plato says art is. It's something that is telling us a lie in order to tell us a truth.
Yeah, and you must also understand that a liar is someone who hides truth out of heaviness. There is like some harmful dimension in lies, which doesn't exist in what God does and says in the Bible or in the Quran. This is not the same thing. The way God's act in both of these books is more like a teacher. It's like a pedagogy. So infernalism is like a way to tame people and to make them to grow slowly. And by time, when they will be educated and grown enough, they would be able to love and to worship God without the fear of eternal hell.
I think we're approaching the 50 minutes. Were there other questions or comments that either of any of y'all?
We still got a good 15 minutes.
We
or
do?
So
I thought we
left.
started at 45.
No, there was a while of getting you started.
Oh, okay. My bad.
I think we at least have 10 minutes.
Okay, yes. So we have 10 minutes. But in either case, were there questions or comments y'all had?
Well, I don't want to pivot this completely in a different direction, but I guess I might. One thing that I know that the both of you two talk about, from, again, different traditions, is the sort of sense of the illusion of the self, the killing of the ego. And I know, Semyon, you and I used to talk about this in conversation between us, and you are obviously very inspired by Buddha and Buddhist tradition. You're very well read in Buddhist tradition. I used to push back against some of that. But I've kind of come around, and partially because Corey has talked a lot about this, that idea is actually true, but in a far more mystic and esoteric sense, not very talked about as much in the Orthodox tradition. That actually there is a very similar idea of the
and
illusion
even in
of
some
self.
areas of the Western Catholic tradition as well.
Right, but
Yeah.
it is.
I mean, even in Christianity, there is a concept of erasing the ego in the face of God. So this is not something very new. I mean,
yes.
It's a pretty universal idea. You can find even in Christianity.
Yeah, and so I've been more receptive to that more recently. And like Corey, you talk about this quite a lot, especially when you come from a psychoanalytic point of view. Could we maybe talk about that? Maybe how that works in Islam, how that works in Christianity. Maybe we can. I'll leave it to the two of you, but maybe to discuss that a little bit.
That's a good question, and it's a good way to end this talk, because in Islam there is a very important concept which identify mankind not as a set of individuals in themselves, but more like the parts of what we call Adam al-Ruhani.
Yes.
The greater Adam. The greater Adam.
This is Gregory of Nyssa all the way, yes.
So this greater Adam is wishing to be saved and to be elevated into heavens. He longs for Jannah. And we are all parts of it, like organs, like cells, like eyes, and we are all manifestation of this Adam, this primordial Adam. And there is a question that I would want to ask to you. So, how can we conceive salvation of Adam al-Ruhani if not all his parts are saved?
Yeah.
I mean, would Adam be saved if even one of his finger is in the fire?
Yeah, entirely. No, so basically, I think this is where the West screws up, because you already have Augustine just off the bat damning eternally Adam and Eve, right? In the East tradition, it's not entirely screwed up. It's just kind of forgotten about. I mean, we have Gregory of Nyssa, who basically says exactly what you're saying, the Adamic pleroma, that humanity is not composed of individuals, but actually parts of Adam. And some of those cells, right, some of those parts have to go through purgation in a more intense way than others, because they have to be taught a greater lesson. But in either case, they're all in the process of being forged back into the original part of Adam to be united with Christ in matrimony. And the mystical saints, like especially Saint Simeon the New, although you also get this tradition in a lot of Western Catholic saints, like Catherine of Siena, for example, that we aren't speaking entirely metaphorically when we talk about the actual marriage between Christ and the church, and that the church is actually the completion of Adam, of what Adam was meant to be before he was split, between male and female in the Garden of Eden, that we are returning to the original Adam, complete without division. And generally the sort of church fathers that talk about this are either somewhat obscure or when they talk about this, no one ever really talks about those phrases or paragraphs where we're mentioning this. But to me, I read this and it's like, this is the center of salvation. This is the center of soteriology in Orthodox thought. But you almost never see it mentioned. And this is exactly what David Bentley Hart brings up in his book, That Also Be Saved, that we keep forgetting or overlooking what Gregory Nyssa is talking about in the Adamic Pleroma, the blooming forth of God's divine being through the reunion between Adam and Christ. So it's very much on that same wavelength. It's just very in the shadows or esoteric, not really talked about in that tradition. But I entirely agree with you. It doesn't really make sense unless it is all reunified and crowned in Adam.
I mean, exclusive salvation wouldn't make sense if all men are in fact parts of the same entity wishing to be saved. So in some way, I can understand why, in the exoteric sense, you will not have much discourse about it. That's, well, because as I said earlier, infernalism is necessary, absolutely necessary for people. So I know it can be frustrating to see many people embrace infernalism with, this idea of primordial Adamic entity in head, but I do think that in the end there is a great wisdom in this, in this dichotomy between conventional discourse, which is meant to be a pedagogy, and absolute discourse, which is a matter of truth, and in which most of religion finally join together.
There's also a very direct existential relation in an everyday way where the question comes up of what is the experience of those in paradise, knowing those who are damned or their loved ones or whoever, regardless of even their loved ones on earth, because the idea is that your state in paradise is this universal love of man. It seems kind of absurd. And I none of the answers to this are very satisfying to me. Like, you get Lombard and Aquinas who say that those in heaven in paradise take pleasure in sort of Schadenfreude in the punishment of the damned. And then you get really bad Protestant answers that God just memory wipes, which is like God is actively creating ignorance, which just seems totally antithetical to the Christian God or any, actual Abrahamic idea of God for that matter. It's like there's no intellectually honest solution to this problem, unless you go universalist, right? But
I think you have to keep in mind that when, for example, Thomas Aquinas writes that the saved take pleasure in the torments of people who aren't saved and who are craving for God in hell. It's not necessarily to be taken as a statement of truth, but rather as a statement of pedagogy, as I said earlier. So
I see.
Yeah, there is no paradox into defending such vision, and at the same time, in your inner self, to be universalist. And well, I've read a lot of Thomism recently, and it's a posterior judgment, but I do not think that Thomas Aquinas would think openly what he wrote if he knew more people of diverse faith and opinion. I think universalism can be built better when there is alterity, And what I appreciate a lot in Islam is that when it expanded the first time, it encountered various religions, ranging from Hinduism to Zoroastrianism and Mazdaism, Buddhism, and it had to compose with all this faith and to produce something, a discourse on this faith. Why? where they face at the same time so beautiful and true, but also in some way false. So they had to develop a lot of books, and I think that it's a shame that we don't translate more works of the Islamic world, because there is beautiful books about Hinduism and Buddhism in the Islamic tradition, books of studies and books of refutation, of course, but also attempt to reconcile tradition.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I kind of look forward optimistically, and I say optimistically with emphasis. The 21st century is sort of being a recreation of like the golden age of Islam, where you had Christians and Muslims communing together in conversation in a very peaceful, diplomatic way
Yeah,
that was sort of destroyed, and that the 21st century will be this era of all these new translations coming into all the world languages of all these various theologies, and looking at each other, and this explosion of ulteriority, like it was in that golden age. But I don't know if that's going to be the case. But that there's so much potential for that to be the case, right?
your statement looks like a lot what Pierre Teilhard de Chardin said. Yeah, he said he talked about it in his book called The Human Phenomenon, uh, when he said that with globalization and modernization, more people will be connected together, sharing ideas, sharing concepts, sharing hopes, sharing um, their idea of the best theology or the best world. And from this encounter, we can expect the rise of well, not the rise of a global religion, of course, but the rise of a new discourse on religion, and more acceptance, more tolerance, and more understanding between people, without killing our own particularity. Because, of course, when I say that, when I recognize that there is, for example, truth in inner Christianity, for example, it's not to say that we should all merge our religion and to create some new religion. No, it's more like a recognition of a way for God to guide us in various paths, and to permit us to be rich from this diversity. For example, in Quran, it says that God never intended to create one world religion, one people, one mankind united by one religion, and that diversity is wanted and loved by God, and that what matters, it's to run towards the greater good. And as I said earlier, the greater good is, well, in the first place, mundane betterment with times, with cooperation, with human growing, mastering of science and understanding of the universe and its environment, but also in the spiritual realm, the salvation of everyone.
Yeah, and there's a balance there too, because you don't want to go in this chiliastic, perfection of the world by man's means, route either, which I kind of sometimes fear Deschardins might be going towards. I don't know. I can't really speak very authoritatively, but there's definitely a sense in which, for everything that is terrible about industrialism and modernity and modern technology, the sort of silver lining is precisely that it grants this possibility of communality in a good sense of actually sharing religious views, but or philosophical ideas. But again, I'm just by nature very cynical, but I can hope nonetheless against that cynicism that might happen. We are more or less at the 15-minute hour. Were there final closing comments from anyone?
Well, I don't have a closing comment, but I kind of have a closing question that may drag us over for a few more minutes, but I think we can allow it. Um, I was thinking about this throughout the podcast, but particularly in the last few minutes. There's a troubled history between Islam and Christianity. And I was thinking about this during the podcast and recently, um, there is, I think of Dante describing hell,
Mhm.
and he describes in his city of hell that it is filled with many mosques, because in Dante's idea, the opposite of Christianity, what was hellish to someone of his time was Islam. That
Mhm.
was, you look at C.S. Lewis and his portrayal of Narnia, and the I forget what they're called, but the Eastern world that was very much against God and against Narnia was very clearly inspired by Islam and the
Yeah.
the Arab world. Then you see in America here, we're still over 20 years later have a very reactionary image of Islam regarding 9/11. And there's still a lot of people who are just immediately write off Islam as some sort of evil because of
A moon cult
that
is what the
cultural,
Protestants call it.
yeah,
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
yeah, the cultural trauma of that event over 20 years ago. And then I know it's particular for you, Semyon, because you live in Paris, and here you are, a very faithful Muslim. You're also a born Frenchman, and I know that in Paris there were a series of attacks, and then at the same time there was a Greek Orthodox, I believe, priest, if I'm not mistaken, who made an attack and pretended to be Muslim, writing off of those series. And then I know that in your politics, I know you're involved in politics. I'm not quite as aware, but I know that this issue comes up about Islam and its influence in Europe. So, but that hasn't always been the case. And there have been times in history in which there seems to have been a really great communication between Christians and Muslims, and there was not this animosity, and there was actually a lot of fellowship between these two religions. So I just am curious to hear, both of your thoughts on what the relationship should be between Islam and Christianity and the Western world and the Muslim world, and what that hopefully could look like going forward.
It's very difficult to respond to this question because it's a very political question. Yeah, because most of the animosity we saw in history were mostly driven by either political or economical motives. So in the field of theology and religion as themselves, we can try to build bridge of understanding and to share our common points to try to establish a policy of good neighboring regarding alterity. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget the importance of politics in these matters. And when there is states, when there is a group of states representing a civilization, such human construction want to expand. That's natural. And with the expansion, when you meet alterity, it somehow transforms the perspective of cooperation in a perspective where there shall be one dominated party and one dominating party. And this is very problematic. But I would say that this question is mostly about how we view community and how we view statehood and how we view the projection of statehood and civilization outside its border. Should we build this projection under the scope of cooperation, coordination, or just focused on a more ancient conception where state projection were in fact imperial attempts to rise. So it's very complicated to solve this problem, but I'm very hopeful to the fact that in the following centuries there will be less and less influence of political alterity in favor of the rise of some. Well, it's maybe a bit pretty naive, but the rise of some human village where people recognize that there is difference, but that this difference are the occasion for discovery, diversity, and growing knowledge and cooperation. So that's my opinion, and I do understand that it may be a bit naive, but yeah, that's what I hope for future. But it's very political. There will be no solution if politicians don't move themselves. And as for living in Paris as Muslim, I would say that it's not that complicated because, you know, people here are in Paris, especially, are globalized people. So when you live in such a village, you are like, well, you don't build your identity regarding a very specific community which crystallize alterity in aggressivity and conflicts, but rather you try to gather people regarding more complex stuff, such as how you conceive society, or you conceive the social contract, what you aspire for you and your neighbor. So yeah, it's more. I mean, religion do not play a very important role here in society because, you know, France is very secular and have a long history of, well, I'm not very proud of it, but persecuting religious people. So religion here is very, very discreet, and people make an important care to not to hide it, but to not talk much about it.
I guess my view on here is still pretty cynical. I think as long as we're in the reigns of Mammon, in the reigns of the rule of this world, he favors either this cosmopolitanism without any borders, without any boundaries, ultimate production of capital, and the total annihilation of differences to make everyone this, you know, so-called globo homo blob, or absolute war and destruction at all cost against everyone who's different than us. I think God grants ages, you know, these golden ages where he permits us a glimpse into the heavenly kingdom where we can have these conversations and they sort of die out and they continue to remind generations of what could be. But I think that's a very rare gift to those who are born in that time, which may very well be a time we're coming up on. I don't know, but I don't think it's something that can be sustained very long. Well,
does anyone want to add something?
Did that answer your?
Well, actually, sorry, what?
Did it answer your question?
Yeah, that did answer your question.
Yeah.
We have one final closing question for you that has been very much on the mind of our host Calvin here, and he really wants to ask you one last question, if you don't mind, Semyon.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, sure.
When I first learned where you're from and where you're living, I knew that the main question I had to ask: what is your preferred way to prepare the traditional French dish, French fry?
For French fries, well, you have to take the right kind of potatoes. And firstly, here we take mostly shallots. I don't know if you know this kind of potatoes. Yeah. So you have to take the right kind of potatoes first. And well, I think to cut them, you know, not in very thin ways, like you can see it in some fast food, but
So you like the thicker cut?
yeah, like a bigger cut, a more rectangular shape, you know. And also, do not put a lot of oil when you cook them, because well, French usually love their potatoes in oven, not cooked with oil, you know. As you can see it in fast food. So we love to eat French fries cooked in oven. It's very different, but I think it's as good as even if not better than what you can test in America.
What condiments or sauce do you recommend serving with them?
Depending on the meat. But
Ketchup?
oh no ketchup. You can serve them with mayonnaise is a good sauce, but true mayonnaise. Like when not mayonnaise you can find in industry. You have to add some mustard. You have to add some or mayonnaise is very. I will send you the recipe. It's very easy to do, but not ketchup. We don't use ketchup for fries here.
And what do you call them in France? What I'm sure you don't call them French fries. What do you call them?
Frites.
Frites.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
it's like literally fried.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Well, thank you for answering.
I think that has covered all the topics we wanted to discuss today. Yes.
Thank you, Semyon,
amazing.
for showing up. This was a very enlightening discussion.
Yeah, I want to personally thank you, Semyon, because I know I pressured and teased you all day to come on, and I appreciate you doing so, even though it was inconvenient for you.
You know, I did a very French thing because in France people don't like to work and to be moved, and they like to just rest and to be taking life easy. And when they are lazy to do something, they say, "Oh, je suis indisposé," meaning you're feeling not so well and you can do anything. So we always find a reason to not work or to not come to some stuff. But hopefully, I always fulfill my words, and I forced my Frenchness to be coerced by it.
Well, as a Colombian, we have a very similar
Let's just say
heritage.
as like non-American, non-Germans.
Yeah.
We put our flesh into submission.
Yeah. Well, Semyon was just telling me, because I was giving him a lot of shit for being this way, and he said, actually, us French are a lot more productive than the Germans.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was surprised.
In 1 hour, we produce more activities and wealth than the Germans. Yeah, the Germans are our rivals.
Yeah. Fuck the Germans.
Offers reference for comparison is Germany. So.
But the Germans like making it look like they're very busy, like Americans, like, oh, we have all this work to do, can't do anything.
But be assured that if you come in France here for 1 year, you will end up you will be transformed into some Frenchman.
Yeah. Well,
You will not like
I'm already
to work.
halfway.
You will talk about philosophy and politics, and that's very French. Complain also.
We'll have to come to France for a year then. That's what it sounds like. All right. Well, thank you, Semyon, so much for coming on. I hope to have you back again sometime to talk about these things more. I know we all have some ideas in mind, so I'll keep you updated. But thank you so much for taking the time and talking with us today.
Thank you as well.
We'll see you next time.
Au revoir.
Yeah, see you. Au revoir.